Hello and welcome to PGurus channel. I have the pleasure of Professor Subhash Kak's company, and he has been tweeting away lately about the relationship of Sanskrit with Slovenian and Lithuanian cultures and their languages. He has been doing a lot of research on this subject about how Sanskrit may have influenced them. In fact, it may have even been the root based on which these languages evolved. And I thought it might be a great idea for us to reach out to Professor Subhash Kak ji to find out a little bit more about his findings. Sorry for using the fine word in many ways. Professor Subhash ji, welcome to PGurus channel.
Thank you, Sri Ayerji. Delighted to be a part of this conversation. The problem of the relationship between European and North Indian languages has intrigued people for a long time. And for Europeans themselves to theorize about it has been this path of self-discovery. Hey, where are we from? And in the beginning, it was generally believed that Sanskrit was the oldest and perhaps the original homeland of the Sanskritic speaking people was in somewhere in India. But later on, as Europe became more prosperous and assertive, depending upon the region where the scholar was from, if the scholar was from Germany, then the scholar came up with the theory that Germany was the original homeland. If the scholar was from Ukraine, then the scholar said Ukraine was the original homeland, and so on. And this is how the debate has progressed. And linguists came up with a hypothetical language for which there is no evidence whatsoever, called PIE, or Proto-Indo-European. And eventually they relegated Sanskrit to one corner of all of this, even though this is the oldest attested language of the Indo-European family. And that's where in the Western academia, things have stood for some time. But of late, there have been very serious challenges to it. There was an Indian linguist named Misra who 40, 50 years ago said, well, this whole thing was wrong. And he came up with detailed arguments as to why this was wrong. And what has happened also more recently is that it's becoming clear, first of all, that Europe was not always populated by people who spoke Indo-European languages. In fact, in most likelihood, the original languages of Europe were related to Basque, which is still spoken in the corner of France and Spain, and Etruscan, which is now, of course, lost. It was spoken in Italy, and Finnish, which is a different language which does not belong to the Indo-European family. And now it's believed that the Indo-European family intruded into Europe much later. In fact, if you look at the Celts, they believe they came from the East. And then there are very intriguing similarities between the religion of the Celts and the Vedic religion. And as the pre-Christian religions of different parts of Europe have been studied in the past 50, 100 years, they've discovered that the deities or divinities that were worshipped were Vedic divinities. In fact, in the Slavic world, the chief divinity was Perkonus, which is a different way of saying Parjanya. And then there were also Shiva and the goddess, and Kshama or Ksha, Bhumi, and many other of these gods and goddesses that are a part of the Vedic pantheon, who were worshipped in different parts of Europe. Now, of course, then people would say, well, did the Vedic religion come into India from outside? Well, first of all, what's important to note here is that this very conception that everything came from one, which is a biblical conception that originally there was one language which became very many, is too simplistic. And in most likelihood, there were many languages which were current in different parts of the world, and the process by which some specific languages became dominant was a very complex one, which involved both diffusion and also some migration of people. Now, there are some theories that the steppes of Asia, the steppe lands, which is Central Asia right now, which in itself cannot support much population, was that passageway over which some ideas, culture, and other religious concepts went from India to Europe. And there is some evidence which supports it. For example, ancient records speak of Gete or Jete, who were one of the peoples in Central Asia, and they even came as far south as north of Greece, and the Thracian region, or the people who spoke the Thracian language, were these. And according to scholars such as Toynbee, a famous scholar who put the larger currents of history together 50, 70, 80 years ago, these were the Jats. And so the Jats who are very substantial populations in Pakistan and India. And when Bin Qasim came to India, the Sindh region had a very substantial Jat population. And as we know, Jats are very numerous in Uttar Pradesh, in Haryana, in Punjab. And they speak Indo-Aryan language. And if they are so numerous, they could not have changed their language. So if the European languages are Kentum or they are different, so they could not have come here in such numerous numbers and then lost their language. If the Roma or the Gypsies who went from India to Europe 1,000 years ago, and in very small numbers, have still held on to their languages. The other mistake that a lot of scholars, historians make, because scholars and historians are also people like us, they make mistakes which are very logically erroneous, is to say that somehow a very large number of people, hordes of people, came pouring down from Central Asia. But Central Asia never could support a large population. And India was the most densely populated region of the ancient world. In fact, if you look at the Indo-European languages of Asia and Europe, 2,000 years ago, 80% of the speakers were within India. And therefore, the regions in Central Asia were very, very sparsely populated. And therefore, it could not have been this way. And then there is also the fact that the words for many different commonly used things are all found in Sanskrit, but they're very different in different parts of Europe. For example, the word for water, which ranges from aqua to voda to vari, or water. In Sanskrit, you have all of these. Ka is also water. Uda is also water. Vari is also water, and so on. So you find all of these in Sanskrit. Now, with regard to Slovenian language, a scholar friend of mine wrote to me just a month ago, and she said, do you know that recent research has shown that Slovenian is probably even closer to Sanskrit than Lithuanian. Until now, it was generally believed that Lithuanian was the closest of all the European languages, but Lithuanian is attested very late, only about 1300 CE or so. It's only 600-700 years old, while, as we know, Sanskrit, even in the most conservative reckoning, as far as the Vedic texts are concerned, is at least 1500 BCE, which is 3500 years. So the time span is very disparate. So the the theory that some people have proposed recently is that there were two different pathways. One is, of course, Central Asia. The other was the waterway, and that's why sometimes one finds closer connection between Latin and Sanskrit than corresponding words in the Germanic or Slavic languages, which are further north. So there was also commerce by ship, and it's indeed true if you read Roman history that the Roman historians ruled the fact that uh, Rome was losing a substantial part of its wealth to the import of spices and other things from India. So Rome and India had a uh, very intense trade, and trade is always not just confined to things. Culture is also another commodity that goes with it. And as you know, the class similar to the Brahmins in India of Rome were the Flamens, the Brahmins and the Flamens. The Flamens were the keeper of the flame because they used to have this fire which was lit all the time, just as a fire was supposed to be kept lit all the time in a Vedic home in India. Now, one small additional point, we see how much of Indian culture went to Southeast Asia, not through war, through trade. You go to Java, you go to Bali, you go to uh, Champa, which is Vietnam, or Cambodia, or even further up, all the way to Japan and China. You find that through trade, such a lot of stuff was internalized. And what is sad is that even though Vedic divinities and deities are worshipped to this date in Japan, in Thailand, in China, Indians are not aware of it because India, for example, Narayana in Thai is Narai. And we already know about Benzaiten, Saraswati in Japan, and so on. So I think time has come for us because the uh, Vedic knowledge is a universal knowledge. It's all about what is the nature of reality, what is the nature of consciousness, and elements of it which were adopted in all these nations of Asia and apparently also elsewhere are universal. They belong to all of humanity. So why not make it easier for people who are so desirous to know deeper aspects of this knowledge, to make it available through institutions like the Germans have the Goethe Institute, which has branches all over the world. So I think India also needs to do it. India has ICCR, but that works at a level more with performance art like dance and music. We need to take the game a couple of notches higher and speak of all this amazing deeper spiritual and psychological knowledge which we can since we have the text which we can trace back to the Vedic rishis.
Speaking of symbols and navigation of our ancestors, I am struck with one observation. The sailors, especially the Cholas and so on, they sailed from the south and they would go across. And this is documented in Tamil literature. They would always take this species of monkeys called as Devangu. Devangu is a Tamil word to denote a certain species of monkey. But the real name was, it was called Deva Vaku. Deva Vaku means God's word. The reason that monkey was referred to as God's word was because it always sat facing north. Think about this. In the ocean, there was no compass. No compass was discovered. India never used compasses. So how did they know where they were going? They were using these this monkey. But unfortunately, over time, the word has become more like a derogatory one. Now, if you want to abuse somebody for being a dunce, you call them you are a devanga. So, which is very unfortunate. But you see how India had this such a evolved system of ways to know where they were going, and how to navigate the waters and so on and so forth. For instance, they almost always, these are all ships which are using sails. They didn't have any steam, propelled ships. So they would only take the currents and the winds, and they'll go. They'll have to wait for 6 months to come back. There was no other way. I mean, So what used to happen was, and I've heard this anecdotal evidence, all the way up to Japan, a father would go and sell something, and then he would get something in return from the Japanese vendor, and he would give his word that even if I don't make it on the next trip, my son will come and settle the dues. And sure enough, the son would go back and say that my father came and this is what I got from you. This is the settlement. I mean, Indian merchants enjoyed a very great prestige because they always were true to their word. I mean, think about it, sir. There was no fax machine, not even telex to try and say what was going on. It was all basically a faith-based economy at that time.
Just a couple of points to what you said. India had knowledge of magnetism. In fact, before I came to talk with you, I was looking at Kalahan's Rajatarangani, and he speaks about how Lalitaditya, who also conquered Uttar Kuru, which is Central Asia, built a temple where the image was suspended between two magnets. And you had such temples also in Mulistan, because when Muhammad Ghori came, he destroyed the temple where the image was suspended. So, and in Java, there were similar temples. So Indians did have knowledge of magnetism. So it's likely that they also had a compass, although we don't know. This is a topic that needs to get into further. And another point is that we now, of course, speak of ourselves as India or as Indians, but in the Javanese language, the direction west is called Bharat. So at that time, when the Cholas went out and did this amazing stuff, did this amazing art all over Asia, India was called Bharat. I think we need to reclaim that word, because India has this whole baggage of Western, colonial, and sometimes racist scholars forcing their views and even doing fabrication of data. So we need to go back and present this Bharatic or Bharatiya position back and embrace it and reclaim it for ourselves.
To add to your point about the Murti being suspended, I believe there were 3 more temples. One was the Sun Temple in Konark, where the sun god. I mean, I don't know if you have seen that temple, sir. It must have been magnificent, because it faces east, and the sun rays would come all the way and strike the Murti, and the Murti was supposed to have been suspended, held together by magnets. There are 3 such temples that I know of. One was Chidambaram Nataraja, the other was Konark Temple, and the other was Somnath Temple. And
Multan as well. Somnath.
And Mulistan, and you added one more, 4. I guess what
Java is
yeah, and 5 Java, right. So you can see that this is growing. In fact, if you go to the Konark Temple, have you been to the Konark Temple, Subhashji?
sadly not yet.
So here is the amazing thing: the 2 stones, the construction of the temple, the 2 stones are not held together by brick and mortar. They poured molten iron into it. I mean, you take a magnet, the thing just goes zoop and hits the walls. And he'll show you, the guide will show you, look, molten iron was poured through all these things to hold them together. That's how strong that the temple is. I certainly have I've been blown away by the architecture. I went there about 20 years ago. I'm sure I'm a wiser man now. I might be able to observe more things, but that Konark temple was something else. I'm sorry. I think we're kind of drifting away from the conversation. We're talking about Sanskrit's impact on various languages. Perhaps we can have another hangout on Lalitaditya's reign, because this is one of those things that kind of doesn't get mentioned in our history books. In PGurus, I carried one chapter. I had a series called The Real History of India, where I had carried one chapter about Lalitaditya, because it was 700 AD or thereabouts, and he's supposed to have driven back the Bin Qasim's successors and so on and so forth, and established the kingdom, and it went all the way up to Uzbekistan and so on and so forth. So that the topic for another day. But Subhash, is there anything else you would like to add so before we wrap up this conversation?
Well, I think there is going to be a renaissance of Sanskrit, and clearly there's much greater interest in Sanskrit in the new generation in Europe, which wants to be connected to its past, and so they want to know how and why the divergences occurred, and how one can obtain greater insight into their own culture by looking at all the wisdom that Sanskrit offers them, not Sanskrit as a language itself, but all the amazing stuff that was written in Sanskrit language on all kinds of topics. So I think to return to this whole question of parallels, what we have to also see is the world of languages within India itself, because sometimes we forget how much of a binding force Sanskrit is, not just in North Indian languages, but also across Asia. You look at Japan, and you look at Indonesia, the Bahasa there, or Cambodia, and certainly in Thailand, where the newly installed king last year had the ritual done in Sanskrit.
Wow. And 44 of the Lok Sabha elected MPs in 2019 took their oath in Sanskrit. And I know for a fact that in Rajasthan, Sanskrit is offered as a third language. You have Hindi, you have English, and many students are encouraged to study Sanskrit through their primary school education. I don't know how widely established that is, but that is an option. I know that Gujarat also has a very robust Sanskrit program. So this needs to be something that all of India, perhaps all the world, needs to stand behind, because this is the most refined language. So thank you very much, Subhash. We'll be back with more things to discuss about Sanskrit.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Namaskar.